The secrecy surrounding the development of nuclear weapons was really something to be admired. The fact that so many people were able to keep that secret. To think of how many people actually kept their mouths shut while working on such secret clandestine projects is really something to be admired. However, the secrecy was more in the interest of protecting the government and their projects more so than it was to protect the citizens of these countries, whether it was the Bikini Atoll or something a little bit closer to home like what I'm going to talk about today. Today, we're going to look at a now defunct facility located in the foothills of the Colorado Rocky Mountains that specialized in manufacturing plutonium pits, which are sort of the trigger mechanisms for nuclear weapons. The plutonium pit hit another radioactive material section of the bomb, and that created the reaction that set off the explosion. So, this is the story of the 1957 fire at the Rocky Flats compound in Colorado. Rocky Flats had suffered several contamination events, the major ones being 2 fires and the mismanagement of some barrels that contained some plutonium-contaminated solvents and lubricants. Well, these lubricants that are normally not too hazardous are now touching plutonium, uranium, that kind of thing. Well, now all of a sudden, the lubricant is now radioactive, and that's considered radioactive waste. So they put it in barrels and just put them outside. But apparently they didn't use good enough barrels, or they weren't looked after well enough, and the barrels started to leak. But that's not really the subject of this video. Either way, things got so out of hand that at one point, the Rocky Flats plant was raided by the FBI and the EPA in 1989. Raided by the EPA. That's not something I thought I'd ever would say, but it happened. And I did some internet sleuthing. I really dug deep, and I managed to find a clip of this exact event. Check it out.
What do they do with these things after we seal them?
I hear they dump them in an abandoned chalk mine and cover them with cement.
I hear they're sending them to one of those southern states where the governor's a crook.
Either way, I'm sleeping good tonight.
Well, sir, where should we dump this batch? The playground?
No, all those bald children are arousing suspicion. To the park!
I think it's full, sir.
That's ridiculous. The last tree held 9 drums.
Agent Malone, Environmental Protection Agency. Some Boy Scouts stumbled on your little game of hide the ooze.
All joking aside, this is a deep dive of the worst event at Rocky Flats, which was the fire in 1957. Around 10 p.m. on September 11th, 1957, a fire occurred in Building 71, which was the original plutonium processing facility, the original plutonium processing building on the Rocky Flats campus. And this fire was caused by something you would think would be very preventable. So, plutonium metal, if it's not stored properly, like in a gas-filled-in chamber, like an inert gas-filled-in chamber, it can just combust. At room temperature, plutonium metal can spontaneously ignite, just given the properties of the metal. An atmosphere of dry inert gas is generally required. So the plutonium was being stored in a device called a glove box. And if you've ever seen the old Simpsons episodes where Homer Simpson is working at the nuclear plant and he's got his hands in this container and there's gloves there and he's fondling whatever, that's essentially what it is. It's a sealed container that has gloves kind of built into it, and you put your hands through, and it allows you to safely handle, manipulate, machine radioactive materials or other hazardous materials without exposing yourself to radiation or whatever it may be. So, some plutonium was being stored in this glove box with just air surrounding it. They had a filtration system, but it wasn't the dry inert gases. It wasn't in some sort of container to prevent the spontaneous combustion. Once the plutonium had ignited the gloves and eventually the plexiglass of the glove box itself caught fire, the fire had burned for 10 to maybe 15 minutes before someone eventually found out that this glove box is on fire. This is something that we need to deal with. So they notified the in-house Rocky Flats Fire Brigade. So the firefighters first tried to put out the glove box fire with fire extinguishers that contained carbon dioxide, dry powdered carbon dioxide. This is because spraying plutonium with water can cause the plutonium to undergo an uncontrolled chain reaction, which is not something you want to deal with at all. So when the CO2 wasn't putting out the flames, the firefighters had to resort to water, which did put the flames out. However, the fire had been spreading through the ventilation system and into the building's HEPA filter bank. An explosion in the ventilation system caused the plant operators to cut the exhaust fans as an effort to minimize the release of plutonium contaminants. This wasn't going to prevent the release of a radioactive plume into the Colorado sky, though. The HEPA filter bank that is now burning was the safeguard that prevented the release of plutonium into the environment. With these filters burning, smoke and plutonium dust was freely headed into the air above the power plant. As firefighters were gearing up to battle the blaze in the filter banks, the entire building lost power, which further complicated an already intense situation. You're trying to gear up, you're trying to get sorted. It's dark outside because it's nighttime and you're somewhat underground and the power goes out. It's got to be a boatload of fun. And eventually they made it there, and it took them about 12 hours to put this fire out in the filter banks. And this was already a very dangerous job, as firefighting is inherently, but they're spraying a plutonium fire with water for 12 hours. That's a constant roll of the dice, just all the time, because the uncontrolled chain reaction, which isn't something you want to be at. So, while they're doing this, all of the smoke leaving the building is filled with plutonium particles. Plutonium particles are rather dangerous. So now, the unsuspecting citizens in the area shown on screen here were unwittingly and unknowingly exposed to this plutonium cloud. It took the firefighters from 11 p.m. to 11 a.m. to finally get the fire put out. Now that the fire was put out, the damage could be evaluated and the extent of the release could be determined. This is the part that I find truly awful. I have studied nuclear power in a great deal. I think it is the pathway to energy independence. I think it is the pathway to actually replacing oil and gas when it comes to just day-to-day energy production. So when I see public health entities and sort of the nuclear watchdogs that play a vital role in actually keeping people safe while using such materials, when they knowingly cover things up, it's really bad, because then your average person who doesn't study this stuff and sort of relies on these experts for real information, all of a sudden now they're terrified, because it's like, okay, these people have lied to us before. What makes me think that they're not going to lie to us again? Which I can't blame them. That's a very valid thing. So when this kind of thing happens, it's uber frustrating. And that is what happened in 1957. And it was more so to keep this nuclear weapon technology secret. It was less, hey, we're out to get the citizenry. But either way, I view it as unacceptable, and so did people back then. So now, not helped by this event, when people hear uranium, plutonium, nuclear power, etc., it's just pushing back nuclear energy acceptance by decades. So, given the secrecy of the facility's work, people who may have been exposed were not notified of the accident at Rocky Flats, despite significant contamination of the area downwind of the site. The Atomic Energy Commission said that none of the firefighters had been contaminated, false, and that there was only slight risk of light contamination as a result of the fire at Rocky Flats. The Colorado Public Health Service had said that no abnormal radioactivity was found in the samples, which...
No, the lie detector determined that was a lie.
During the studies following this event, researchers from the Radiological Assessments Corporation and a member of the Health Advisory Panel obtained the public release of significant new information about the fire. The Department of Energy also assisted in locating and declassifying hard-to-find information at the site, with feedback and direction from public members of the Health Advisory Panel. Researchers developed a new and comprehensive understanding of the 1957 fire and the subsequent plutonium releases it caused. Why was it difficult to find out how much plutonium was released? There are several reasons why. Uncertainties remain about the amount of plutonium released at the 1957 fire because 1. Little data about the fire existed. For example, there was no measurements of releases during the fire. 2. Plant officials at the time of the fire did not investigate key questions about the progress of the fire in adequate depth. 3. Although workers wrote personal accounts of their experiences and observations at the time, few of the personnel could be located in 1999 to review and discuss their accounts. 4. Many important aspects of the fire were poorly documented at the time. 5. No samples were taken from the air duct surfaces that led from the glove boxes to the burned out air filters. 6. Immediately following the fire, plant officials' priorities were focused on restarting production, not analyzing the fire. And 7. Only a small number of air, vegetation, and soil samples near the plant were collected and analyzed for radioactivity after the fire. In addition, the fire took place before sensitive and specific methods had been fully developed to distinguish plutonium from other radioactive materials that also emit alpha particles. Despite limitations on reconstructing the 1957 fire events, researchers uncovered historic data and information that were previously unavailable to the public. This additional information and consultation with experts included a nationally recognized fire expert and allowed the researchers to reconstruct a plausible fire scenario and to estimate the amount of plutonium released. The researchers determined that approximately 63 kilograms of plutonium were in the room where the fire occurred, and that 13 to 21 kilograms were actually involved in the fire. It is estimated that between 40 and 500 grams of plutonium-239 and 240 were released into the air and carried off-site. The median estimate was about 300 grams. The release estimate includes large uncertainty expressed as a range of numerical values within which the actual number is likely to fall. This range reflects the difficulties encountered in reconstructing the 1957 fire events and releases. Looking at this picture, you can see the distribution of the plutonium particles over the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. People that were outside as the plume was coming down were at risk of exposure, mostly if they were working or exercising outside at the time. Plutonium produces alpha particles which cannot penetrate the skin. The exposure pathway is to either be inhaled or ingested. Other exposure pathways were from animals that had eaten contaminated plants, such as deer that were then hunted and then eaten by humans. The saddest exposure pathway was how children who were outside playing keep in mind, this is 1957. Kids didn't have iPads or Call of Duty or anything like that. Kids were outside playing in dirt. So yes, children play in literal dirt back then. So this dirt, if you were in these regions, had a nice fresh layer of plutonium particles. And if one of those was to get into your mouth, or you were to breathe in some dust with that, that could have been an exposure pathway. According to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, which is the agency that replaced the old Colorado Health Department that sort of lied about the Rocky Flats risk, these are the key findings of all the studies conducted on pollution created by Rocky Flats. People who lived near the plant and led active outdoor lifestyles had the highest level of exposure to airborne plutonium. These are people like ranchers or construction workers or things like that. Plutonium, a radioactive metal, was the contaminant of primary concern released from Rocky Flats. The largest amounts of plutonium released from Rocky Flats into nearby communities came from the fire at the plant in 1957, from a waste oil storage area in the late 60s, and then another fire that occurred in the exact same way. Another glove box storing plutonium spontaneously combusted and caught it on fire. Luckily, they were a little bit more prepared that time, so they were able to put it out without as substantial of a release as 1957. But it's like, come on, dude. Like, get your shit together. Learn from your mistakes. This has happened once. Probably happened again, and it did happen again. Either way. Carbon tetrachloride, a solvent used at Rocky Flats for cleaning and degreasing, was the key chemical of concern released from the plant. Like I said before, these solvents and things like that were used in the manufacturing process of plutonium. They were coming in direct contact with the plutonium. Therefore, they became radioactive on their own. The individual's location, lifestyle, and period of exposure were found to have greater effect on health risks than gender or age. Soil sampling, conducted by the Citizens Environmental Sampling Committee, coordinated by the Health Advisory Panel, confirmed previous soil sampling studies which showed that the highest off-site plutonium concentrations in soils were predominantly east of the plant. The greatest off-site exposure to plutonium and carbon tetrachloride resulted from people breathing contaminants released into the air. Exposure by ingesting water, vegetables, meat, and through skin contact were found to be significantly smaller than exposures from breathing in plutonium. The main risk of inhaled plutonium is cancer of the lung, liver, bones, and bone marrow. Carbon tetrachloride exposure may cause liver cancer, but this has only been demonstrated at high doses in experimental animal studies. People who live near the plant and led active outdoor lifestyles, such as laborers or ranchers, had the highest level of exposure to airborne plutonium. Of these lifestyles and locations modeled, a laborer living or working southeast of Leiden near Indiana Street and 64th Avenue had the highest risk of developing cancer. The majority of this exposure was due to plutonium inhaled from a Rocky Flats fire on September 11th and 12th, 1957. Health risks due to dioxin and beryllium releases from Rocky Flats were considerably less than the risks from plutonium or carbon tetrachloride. Health risks due to uranium from Rocky Flats were less than the risks from plutonium releases. Accidental release in water of radioactive chemical tritium, which is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen, from Rocky Flats in 1973 to the Great Western Reservoir, was the greatest source of drinking water contamination, but only presented a small off-site health risk. So, how bad was this disaster? It's kind of hard to tell given the secrecy. The time until the people actually knew what happened and the conflicting studies, either way, lying and secrecy don't inspire confidence in these regulatory agencies or the way that media had downplayed the events to help good old Uncle Sam out. I will leave the extent of this disaster up to you. and you can base it off some of the information that I provided. Needless to say, Rocky Flats is now a wildlife refuge, and it is completely gone. I don't live very far away from Rocky Flats, so I was going to go out there and get some footage or whatever, but there's nothing there. There's maybe a few foundations. There's nothing there. And I don't really want to go trouncing around in a place that has this much odd materials just lying around. So it's supposedly all cleaned up. It's now a wildlife refuge, and the building is no longer there, but I can't help but think that part of the reason it's no longer there is just sort of the mismanagement that occurred. So I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time. Thank you for watching.